Good morning, Chairman Crane, members of the committee. My name is Max Nelsen. I'm here on behalf of the Freedom Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting individual liberty, free enterprise, and limited accountable government. House Bill 98 stands for the simple proposition that government should refrain from using taxpayer funds or public resources to subsidize ideological interest groups, in this case, teachers' unions. As the U.S. Supreme Court has recognized, public sector collective bargaining is inherently political, as it necessarily involves questions about the size, cost, and operations of government. Now, many Idaho school districts currently lack authority to determine how they'll handle labor relations because Idaho law requires the roughly 83 school districts with unionized teachers to determine teachers' compensation, benefits, and conditions of employment through collective bargaining. Unfortunately, our research shows that teachers' unions have followed the advice of the National Education Association and taken advantage of the collective bargaining process to shift the cost of union operations and advocacy to Idaho taxpayers, giving the union disproportionate influence that families and taxpayers lack. House Bill 98 would restore balance and fairness by drawing a clear line between school activities and union activities. The legislation would end the legally suspect practice of school districts deducting union dues from teachers' paychecks. It would also prevent teachers from being paid by school districts to engage in union activity at taxpayer expense. Our research shows that this practice occurs in about 50 districts and costs taxpayers about $500,000 per year. Additionally, House Bill 98 would prevent school districts from using taxpayer funds to pay teachers' union dues, protect teachers' privacy by preventing districts from providing their personal contact information to a union without their consent, and would prevent teachers from being required to sit through union membership solicitations as part of their onboarding. These and other common sense reforms in the bill are broadly supported by Idaho voters. With that, I'm happy to address any questions you may have or some of the more creative objections that you may have heard so far in the hearing. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Maxford. There questions? Yes, Representative Barbieri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Maxford, so what I'm hearing you say is that you're drawing a distinction between this particular deduction for political purposes because the Supreme Court has determined that somehow the relationship is political. And so this is a different type of deduction than we would otherwise see. Are there prohibitions against deductions going out for the Democrat Party or for the Republican Party or any of the other parties? Are there prohibitions there?
Maxford?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Barbieri, thank you for the question. So there is an Idaho statute already, the Public Integrity and Elections Act, which prohibits the use of public funds or resources to engage in electoral political activity. There is also, of course, the United States Supreme Court's decision I mentioned in the Janus versus ASME case in 2018, which recognized that when you're dealing with public sector collective bargaining, that process, at least from a First Amendment standpoint, is inherently political because it involves advocacy over the size and cost and scope of government, which are fundamentally political questions. Now, applying that to payroll deduction of union dues, in this case for the Idaho Education Association, I think does raise some interesting legal questions. Because there is no statute in Idaho that authorizes or requires school districts to deduct union dues. Individual districts make that decision currently, and many do not provide that service to the union. But when a district does that, it is lending public resources to the purpose of fundraising for this organization. And as a factual matter, part of the union dues that are collected from teachers' paychecks by a school district, when they do that by a payroll deduction, are used for electoral political activity. Some of that money is sent to the National Education Association in D.C., which does have political funds that are funded entirely by members' dues, and in some cases are even used to influence Idaho elections. So all that to say, I think there's an argument under existing law that this practice is illegal, and I think certainly it's different in kind from the types of employment benefits or even charitable contributions that districts may otherwise process via payroll deduction.
Thank you. Are there further questions? Representative Achilles, followed by Representative Skog.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'd just like to get back to the root question here of, are there really taxpayer funds going to teachers unions in Idaho? So we've established, Mr. Nelsen, from the IEA representative, that $1.8 million is a fake number, right? That is not the case. So now we seem to be focused on this $500,000 of annual expense. So if I divide that by 83 districts, that's about $6,000 per district of taxpayer dollars that we think are being spent on teachers unions. So help me break down that $6,000. How do you guys, where do you see these expenses coming from? And Just, help us understand your math on $500,000 claim.
Maxford?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Achilles, thank you for the question. I think to be clear, what we've clarified is that the IEA's tax return was inaccurate, not that it was a fake number. It was a number on a tax return. Happy to have that clarified on the record before the committee. But even if there is not documented evidence of taxpayer funded government entities writing checks to a teachers union, for example. We've documented exhaustively through our review of school district collective bargaining agreements in Idaho that public time and services, which have value and are paid for by the taxpayer, are being used to support teachers union activity. Now, our estimate about the $500,000 pertains specifically to the amount of time that teachers are excused from their classroom duties to perform taxpayer functions, to perform union functions at taxpayer expense. We've published a report, I believe it's cited in the handout that went before the committee here, that goes through district by district and identifies all of the examples of and the amounts of paid time off per union contract that are provided to teachers to engage in union activity. And we've, basically used the average compensation of an educator in Idaho to roughly estimate how much value there is associated with that time. And to be clear, we're not just talking about grievance processing. We're talking about, in some cases, union contracts that specifically provide designated amounts of paid time to lobby the legislature. This is activity that is certainly in the union's interest as a private organization, and it is being funded with taxpayer-funded time, but it is arguably not in the public interest.
Representative Skog?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking at the NEA website, which I understand gets money from the Idaho Education Association. Is that correct?
I think to phrase it more precisely, the National Education Association gets a cut of the dues that any member of the teachers union in Idaho pays. I think the IEA would say, we don't fund the NEA, and that may technically be true. The local union keeps its portion of the dues and forwards part of the money to the NEA and part of the money to the IEA. But yes, your point is true. The dues paid by Idaho educators are funding the NEA, yes.
Follow-up?
Two follow-ups, if I may. Do you know about how much money goes to the NEA from the Idaho Education Association or other teachers unions in Idaho?
Maxford?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Skog, my understanding is that in this academic year, the NEA portion of the dues equates to about $213 per member.
Follow-up?
Yeah, I'm looking at this website, and it looks like it's all about DEI, promoting DEI. The NEA, I quote, the NEA has spoken out against anti-DEI bills and attacks on DEI programs. Will this bill prevent me as a taxpayer, my money from going to promote DEI programs through the IEA and NEA?
Maxford?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Skog, I think certainly you are correct in your assessment that the NEA is an extremely ideological and a very politically polarizing organization. The Wall Street Journal has acknowledged that the teachers unions like the NEA and the AFT are among the most progressive and ideological organizations that there are in this country. Now, that's not to say anything good or bad about them from a policy standpoint. The point is just they are polarizing, they are politically active, and they have an ideological agenda. And our position is that taxpayer funds and resources should not be used to fund that kind of ideological agenda any more than they should be used to fund, for example, the agenda of the National Rifle Association. And I think this legislation that Representative Boyle has brought forward would do an excellent job of making sure that that type of ideological activity is not being supported with Idaho taxpayer dollars.
Representative Hostetler?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Maxford. I was recently approached from a teacher here in our state who mentioned that one of her colleagues was actively applying for an NEA position and would leave school during school hours to go do what she had to do for that position. And at that point, a substitute would have to be acquired by the school, both of those being paid for essentially by the taxpayer dollars. Is this something that would address a situation like that?
Maxford?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hostetler, thank you for the question. Yes, absolutely it would. There are no limits in Idaho law right now regarding the purposes to which union paid time off can be put. And so many of the contracts that do provide paid time off for union activities do not regulate how that time can be used. It can be used for attending union office. It can be used for, let's say, the local union president who's hired as a full-time classroom educator in the district, wants to run to be an officer of the National Education Association and is elected to serve in a role at the National Education Association. There are contracts in Idaho that would allow that person to be paid on taxpayer time to work on union functions and union purposes. And to be clear as well, the legislation would not prohibit a teacher who is elected to a union position from serving in that role. The legislation would simply say you can't do that at taxpayer expense. You can take an unpaid leave of absence, which is actually something the current law provides. You can use your own PTO or a PTO that's been donated to you by your colleagues, or the union, not the district, the union will track the time that you spend on union activity and then reimburse the district for the value of the wages and compensation that were paid to you by the district, but for which no services were rendered.
Representative Mickelson.
Maxford, Mr. Chairman. Are you aware that the IEA actually pays for the replacement subs for these teachers when they take time off to do these activities?
Maxford.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Mickelson, so we've taken that into account in our district-by-district review. You are correct that in some cases, the union will compensate the district for the cost of hiring a substitute to cover a teacher's absence. That is not always the case. There are a number of circumstances in Idaho where the district pays the cost of the substitute. But even if the union is covering the cost of the substitute, all that is doing is preventing the district from experiencing an out-of-pocket increase in costs. I think as reflected by the fact that we pay substitutes less than you pay full-time classroom educators, I think it's fair to say that you're getting less, the school district is getting less for what it pays when you have a substitute teaching instead of a full-time classroom teacher. The district is still experiencing a reduction of services that has value and that is ultimately being borne by the taxpayers.
Any further questions for Maxford? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony today. Dan McKnight.